Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Texas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the year 1885, the frontier town of Bitter Creek, Texas, situated some 40 miles east of Fort Worth, bore witness to a series of events that would remain buried in county records for nearly a century. The case became known as the Bitter Creek Boarding House, though locals referred to it simply as the Kitchen. What follows is compiled from county sheriff reports, newspaper clippings from the Fort Worth Gazette, church records, and testimonies collected by Texas Ranger James Calloway between February and September of 1885. The establishment in question stood at the edge of town, a modest two-story structure built in the late 1870s during the cattle boom. Constructed of weathered pine with a sloping tin roof that rattled during the frequent Texas thunderstorms, the building featured a saloon on the ground floor and 6 rental rooms above. A separate kitchen stood connected by a covered walkway, unusual in its size for such an establishment. Behind the main building, partially obscured by cottonwood trees, a root cellar had been expanded well beyond typical dimensions, a fact that would later take on sinister significance. By all accounts, Martha Thornhill, a widow in her early 40s, ran a respectable boarding house and saloon that catered primarily to cattle drivers, railroad workers, and the occasional outlaw seeking temporary refuge from the law. Martha stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall with a sturdy build. Her brown hair, streaked with gray, was typically pulled back in a severe bun, and those who knew her described eyes as dark and unreadable as a well at midnight. According to the town ledger, Martha had arrived from Georgia in 1877 following the death of her husband, purchasing the property with funds that no one quite questioned. Parish records from St. Matthew's Church indicate Martha claimed to be the widow of Confederate Captain Harold Thornhill, who supposedly died of wounds sustained at Petersburg. Later investigation by Ranger Calloway found no record of a Captain Harold Thornhill in Confederate Army registries, raising questions about Martha's background that were never fully resolved. The town banker, Theodore Wilson, recalled that Martha paid for the property entirely in gold double eagles, a transaction unusual enough to remember years later. What distinguished Martha's establishment was her renowned cooking. Travelers would detour miles from their intended routes to sample what many described as the most satisfying stew west of the Mississippi. The rich, hearty dish had a distinctive flavor that patrons found difficult to identify but impossible to forget. Martha would only reveal that it contained a special blend of seasonings from the old country and meat raised with particular care. The saloon's popularity grew steadily between 1881 and 1884, particularly among certain outlaw gangs who frequently disappeared into the territories after visiting. Court documents suggest at least 14 known criminals stopped at Martha's establishment before vanishing entirely from official records. Former Deputy Samuel Hawkins remembered the Burleson Gang, 5 men who'd robbed banks from San Antonio to Oklahoma, all stayed at Martha's place in June of '83. We had warrants, but were told they'd moved on, never heard of those men again. At the time, we counted it as good fortune. Now I wonder if we should have looked harder. Similar patterns emerged with members of the Carson brothers, the Sutton-Taylor feud participants, and various lone desperados whose descriptions matched those in Martha's ledger, but who were never apprehended. The first indication that something wasn't right came in January 1885, when a cattle buyer named Thomas Wentworth failed to arrive in Fort Worth after reportedly staying at Martha's boarding house. Wentworth, a representative of the Chicago meatpacking firm Armour & Company, had been traveling through Texas, purchasing cattle for northern slaughterhouses. His business associate, Henry Miller, told the Fort Worth Gazette, "Thomas was a man of precise habits. When he didn't arrive with the contracts, I knew something had happened." Miller rode to Bitter Creek himself, only to be told by Martha that Wentworth had departed 2 days prior, heading south. What Miller noticed, however, was a distinctive pocket watch chain hanging from Martha's apron, identical to one he had gifted Wentworth the previous Christmas. The chain featured small gold nuggets interspersed with links, crafted by a jeweler in Chicago and, according to Miller, unlike any other I'd seen in Texas. When questioned, Martha claimed it was a trinket left by another boarder as payment. Miller's suspicions were raised, but without evidence, local authorities dismissed his concerns. Sheriff William Hargrove reportedly told Miller, "Mrs. Thornhill is a respected businesswoman. We can't go accusing her of theft because a man changed his travel plans." Miller returned to Fort Worth troubled, making notes of his observations that would later become crucial evidence. Throughout February of 1885, 3 more travelers who registered at Martha's boarding house never reached their destinations. A land surveyor named Robert Keller, working for the Texas and Pacific Railroad, disappeared after writing to his employers that he would be staying at the boarding house with the excellent stew while completing measurements. 2 brothers, James and William Dalton, cattle buyers from Missouri, similarly vanished after their horses were found tied outside Martha's establishment. These disappearances might have continued unnoticed had it not been for an unseasonably heavy rainfall in early March that washed away portions of the creek bed behind Martha's property, exposing what a local boy described as strange white sticks that his dog had dug up while playing near the water. The boy, 10-year-old Samuel Parker, later testified, "My dog Rufus was digging something fierce in the mud where the creek bank had washed away. I thought he'd found a rabbit hole, but when I looked, I saw these long white things sticking out of the dirt. I pulled one out, and it had a funny shape at the end." Pa said not to touch anything else and went straight for the sheriff. The boy's father, recognizing these sticks as human finger bones, immediately alerted Sheriff William Hargrove. Initial excavation of the area revealed scattered human remains that had been partially dissolved by lye, a common household chemical used for making soap. According to Hargrove's report dated March 12, 1885, the remains appeared to belong to at least 2 adult males. The condition suggests deliberate dismemberment and chemical treatment to accelerate decomposition. Most disturbing is the apparent precision of the cutting, indicating knowledge of human anatomy or butchery techniques. Dr. Edgar Simmons, the county physician called to examine the remains, noted in his report, "The bones show evidence of having been cut with a saw rather than broken or chopped. The joints have been separated with the skill of someone familiar with the dismemberment of livestock carcasses. Most notably, certain bones show scrape marks consistent with the removal of meat from the bone, similar to what one would observe in prepared animal remains from a kitchen." When Sheriff Hargrove questioned Martha about the discovery, witnesses reported her demeanor remained unnervingly calm. "She offered me stew," Hargrove wrote in his official statement, insisted, "I must be hungry after working in the cold mud." This detail would later take on a more sinister meaning when the investigation expanded to Martha's kitchen. Hargrove, perhaps sensing something amiss, declined the meal, but took the precaution of posting a deputy to watch the boarding house while he telegraphed the Texas Rangers for assistance. Martha Thornhill wasn't alone in her enterprise. County records indicate that in late 1882, she had taken in a young woman named Ruth Collins, described as no more than 20 years of age, slight of build, with unusually quiet demeanor. The circumstances of Ruth's arrival in Bitter Creek remained unclear, though one stagecoach driver recalled bringing a thin, pale girl with no luggage save a single carpet bag and what looked to be a set of kitchen knives wrapped in oilcloth. Ruth, whose background remained largely unknown, served as Martha's assistant in both the kitchen and the boarding house operations. Testimonies collected from townspeople described Ruth as shadow-like and speaking only when spoken to. One regular patron noted, "That girl would stand so still behind the bar you'd forget she was there until she moved." Church records indicate Ruth attended Sunday services regularly, though she never participated in social gatherings afterward. The pastor's wife, Eleanor Reynolds, later testified. She would sit in the last pew, lips moving in prayer, or perhaps just mouthing the words of hymns. After service, she would slip away before anyone could engage her in conversation. Once I asked about her family, and she said only that Mrs. Thornhill is all the family I need now. There was something in her tone that discouraged further questions. The relationship between Martha and Ruth became a central focus of the investigation after Sheriff Hargrove noticed the younger woman's unusual behavior during his initial questioning. According to his notes, the Collins woman maintains a fixed stare throughout questioning. When asked directly about the meat supplies for the establishment, she began humming softly. Upon further inquiry about the source of their provisions, she deferred to Mrs. Thornhill, stating, "Martha knows what feeds the hungry best." The peculiarity of her phrasing and manner raised immediate concerns. Deputy James Wilson, who maintained surveillance on the boarding house the night after the bones were discovered, reported unusual activity that added to the growing suspicions. Shortly after midnight, he wrote, I observed both women carrying heavy sacks from the main house to the kitchen building. They made 3 such trips. Later, around 3 a.m., smoke began rising from the kitchen chimney, unusual for that hour. The smell was unlike normal cooking, had a strange, sweet quality that reminded me of the time we found a dead steer being burned by ranchers after it had been dead too long to salvage the meat. What happened next would transform a disturbing discovery into one of the most troubling cases in Texas criminal history. Texas Ranger James Calloway, responding to Hargrove's request for assistance, arrived in Bitter Creek on March 15, 1885. A veteran of numerous criminal investigations and known for his methodical approach, Calloway brought much-needed expertise to the case. With more authority and investigative experience, Calloway immediately secured the boarding house as a crime scene and conducted a thorough search of the premises. Calloway's first action was to separate Martha and Ruth for questioning. He interviewed Martha in the saloon while deputies searched the upstairs rooms, finding little of note besides a ledger recording guests dating back to 1881. The entries, while appearing ordinary at first glance, contained unusual notations besides certain names, a small X mark, and what appeared to be measurements written in a numeric code. Martha explained these as indications of whether guests had paid their bills and estimates of how much they had consumed during their stay, explanations Calloway found plausible but unconvincing. In the cellar of the boarding house, behind a false wall disguised as shelving for preserved foods, Calloway discovered what his official report described as a processing room of methodical design. The space contained butchering tools, several large metal tubs, barrels of lye, and a drainage system leading directly to the creek. Most disturbing were the personal effects, watches, rings, boots, and wallets, organized methodically on wooden shelves, each item apparently kept as a trophy. According to Calloway's report, the collection appears to represent at least 20 individuals, arranged chronologically, judging by the dust accumulation and organization system. Each item was tagged with a small paper label bearing a date and what appears to be a weight measurement. Among these items, Calloway found Thomas Wentworth's distinctive watch chain, still attached to his timepiece. The initials T.W. were engraved inside the watch case, confirming Miller's suspicions had been correct. But the implications of the discovery went far beyond simple robbery and murder. The arrangement of the cellar, with its proximity to the kitchen above, suggested a more horrifying purpose for the bodies of those who disappeared. Particularly disturbing was a set of butcher's diagrams pinned to the wall, showing cuts of meat, but not from any livestock. The drawings, made on brown butcher paper in precise detail, outlined a human form with dotted lines indicating where cuts should be made. Beside these were notes in a delicate feminine hand, later identified as Ruth's, describing the best uses for each section and recommended cooking times. One notation read, thigh section, slow cook 3+ hours with red wine and juniper. Best served with story of Texas Longhorn steak aged in whiskey barrels. When confronted with the evidence from the cellar, Martha reportedly showed no remorse or surprise. According to the transcript of her interview, she simply stated, "Waste not, want not. That's what my mama always taught me. Men come through, cause trouble, eat my food, drink my whiskey. Some just need to contribute more directly to the establishment." Ruth Collins, by contrast, collapsed into what the attending physician described as a state of catatonic withdrawal, remaining unresponsive for several days. The investigation expanded to include an analysis of the kitchen and its supplies. Though conclusive forensic techniques were limited in 1885, examination of the meat stored in Martha's kitchen raised disturbing questions. Dr. Joseph Lambert, a physician from Fort Worth who assisted in the investigation, noted in his report, "The meat portions in the storage room display cutting patterns inconsistent with conventional butchery of livestock. Several pieces retain what appear to be characteristic features of human anatomy. Most notably, one large portion preserved in salt appears to be a human shoulder and upper arm, though prepared in such a way that casual observation might mistake it for a pork shoulder." The kitchen itself was unusually well equipped for a frontier establishment. Imported cast-iron cookware from France, German cutlery of the highest quality, and an extensive array of spices, many exotic for the region, suggested a level of culinary sophistication at odds with the boarding house's rustic exterior. A large copper rendering pot, typically used for converting animal fat to tallow, showed evidence of frequent use. Chemical analysis of residue from this pot revealed traces of lye mixed with organic matter consistent with rendered human fat. Records from the general store in Bitter Creek revealed that Martha purchased surprisingly little meat, given the reputation of her establishment for hearty stews. The store owner, Elijah Peterson, provided ledgers showing Martha's purchases consisted primarily of vegetables, flour, and spices, with only occasional small amounts of beef or pork. "Always thought it strange how she fed so many with so little," Peterson testified. She'd joked that her secret ingredient was just a little bit of love. Gives me the shivers now to think on it. The store records also showed regular purchases of lye in quantities far exceeding normal household requirements for soap making or cleaning. When questioned previously about these purchases, Martha had apparently explained them as necessary for maintaining sanitary conditions in a busy boarding house. Peterson recalled, "Said she had to keep things extra clean on account of having so many dirty cowboys and travelers coming through." Made sense at the time. Nobody questions a woman who keeps a clean house. As word of the investigation spread, travelers who had previously dined at Martha's establishment came forward with accounts of distinctive tasting stew that Martha insisted contained special game meat that she acquired through private means. Some reported unusual drowsiness after eating, suggesting the possible use of sedatives to render victims more manageable. A cattle driver named Michael O'Brien testified, "Ate there in January. Stew tasted different than any venison or beef I ever had. Had a sweetness to it. After eating, I could hardly keep my eyes open. Woke up fully dressed on my bed the next morning with no memory of going upstairs. My money was still in my pocket, so I thought nothing of it then. Now I wonder if I wasn't being sized up for the pot myself." One particularly valuable testimony came from Jacob Winters, a ranch hand who had worked briefly for Martha in late 1884. In his sworn statement, Winters described hearing strange sounds like sawing and chopping from the cellar late at night. When he inquired about it the next morning, Martha explained she was preparing special cuts and offered him extra pay to deliver sealed packages to certain recipients in neighboring towns. These packages, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, were heavy for their size and sometimes leaked a dark fluid that smelled of strong spices. Winters quit the position shortly after, claiming the work made him uneasy in ways I couldn't rightly explain. Winters also recalled an incident that took on new significance in light of the investigation. One night, a drunk cowboy got rough with Miss Ruth, grabbing at her while she served drinks. Martha stepped in, calm as you please, and offered him a special meal on the house to make up for his wait. Next morning, Martha said he'd left before dawn. His horse stayed in the stable 3 more days before she said she'd sell it for unpaid boarding fees. Never thought much about it until now. The case took an unexpected turn when investigators discovered a small leather-bound book hidden in Ruth Collins's quarters. The journal, written in a meticulous hand, contained what appeared to be a coded record of visitors, including physical descriptions, estimated weights, and cryptic notations about quality and yield. More disturbing were the recipes, written in the same hand, detailing preparation methods for what the writer referred to only as long pig, a term later identified as a euphemism for human flesh. An entry dated October 12, 1883, read, Subject, male, approximately 35 years, trail boss from Wyoming Territory, weight estimate, 190 pounds, quality, excellent, lean muscle, minimal waste, yield, 93 pounds usable, notes, whiskey drinker, flesh required extra soaking to remove bitterness, preparation method number 3 with extended brine, reserve heart and liver for Martha's special occasion meals. The journal revealed that Ruth's role was far from that of an unwilling accomplice. Her writings suggested a calculated partnership with Martha, one in which she took particular pride in developing methods to tenderize and flavor their specialized cuisine. In one entry dated November 1883, Ruth wrote, M says my braining method has improved the texture considerably. The rangers who came through yesterday commented it was the finest stew they'd ever tasted. If only they knew they were dining on the marshal from El Paso who passed through last month. Poetic justice, as he was here looking for the very outlaws we served him alongside. The mixing of meats creates a complexity of flavor that disguises the true nature of the primary ingredient. Other entries detailed experiments with different preparation methods, aging the meat in the cellar's cool environment, using various marinades to mask any distinctive flavor, and incorporating strong spices, particularly those from Mexican traders, to create the unique taste that had become the establishment's signature. Ruth's writings displayed not just culinary knowledge, but a disturbing pride in her innovations. Traditional butchers waste so much. I've developed methods to use virtually everything. Bones for stock, fat for cooking. Even the rendered tallow makes superior candles with a distinctive aroma that customers find oddly comforting. The references to specific victims in the journal allowed investigators to begin identifying the remains found near the creek and in various stages of processing throughout the property. By the end of March 1885, they had confirmed at least 7 identities, with evidence suggesting the total number of victims might exceed 20 over the 4-year period of the boarding house's operation. The journal also revealed a careful selection process and business methodology behind the killings. Martha and Ruth apparently maintained relationships with stagecoach drivers and trail guides who, for a fee, would direct specific types of travelers to the boarding house. An entry from September 1884 noted, Driver Simmons delivered as promised. Subject arrived alone, carrying significant funds from cattle sale. No family connections mentioned, no one expecting him in Fort Worth until next week. Ideal candidate. Perhaps most chilling was the apparent selection process Martha and Ruth employed. The journal entries indicated a preference for solitary travelers with quality flesh, particularly those who appeared healthy and well-fed. They specifically targeted individuals who seemed unlikely to be missed immediately, outlaws on the run, drifters between jobs, and travelers who mentioned having no family. According to one entry, the Easterner today mentioned writing to his mother weekly. M says we must let this one go on his way. Too risky, better to wait for someone with fewer attachments. The cattle buyer arriving tomorrow appears promising, large, well-fed, and mentioned he's not expected in San Antonio for at least 10 days. Descriptions of the chosen victims often included assessments of their character, suggesting the women viewed their actions as somehow justifiable when targeting certain individuals. Entries described some victims as cruel to his horse, meat likely tough from stress, spoke disrespectfully about female companions, will enjoy serving him to the ladies' church committee, or boasted of cheating business partners, no loss to the world. This pattern suggested a distorted moral framework in which Martha and Ruth saw themselves as delivering a form of frontier justice while profiting from their victims. The question that haunted the investigation was how Martha and Ruth lured their victims to their deaths. Testimonies from former guests who had survived their stay suggested a pattern. Martha would offer certain travelers, particularly those traveling alone with valuable possessions, special accommodations at reduced rates. These preferred guests would be served a private late dinner, often accompanied by Martha's homemade whiskey, reportedly potent enough to make a man's legs forget their purpose. A traveling salesman named Frederick Johnson, who had stayed at the boarding house in early 1885, provided a potentially crucial account. Mrs. Thornhill took a particular interest in my well-being, insisted I looked too thin and needed proper feeding. She served me personally in a private dining room off the main saloon while Miss Collins tended bar. The stew was unusual but flavorful, and the whiskey had an odd sweetness. After 2 glasses, I felt unusually drowsy. I recall Mrs. Thornhill helping me to my room, saying something about seeing if you're suitable. I woke with a terrible headache and a strange soreness in my arm where I found a small puncture mark. I assumed I'd scraped against something in my stupor. Now I wonder if I was being sampled. The discovery of a small vial of clear liquid in Martha's personal quarters provided a potential answer. Dr. Lambert's analysis suggested it contained laudanum, a common opiate tincture that, in sufficient quantity, could render a person unconscious. Several empty medicine bottles found in the trash heap behind the kitchen tested positive for chloral hydrate, another sedative readily available at frontier pharmacies as a sleep aid. The working theory became that Martha would drug selected victims who would then be dealt with during the night by both women. Supporting this theory were modifications to one of the guest rooms that distinguished it from the others. This particular room, which Martha's ledger indicated was often assigned to travelers who later disappeared, featured unusual alterations: a reinforced bed frame with leather straps attached to the underside, a floor that subtly sloped toward a small drain in the corner, and walls that had been soundproofed with quilted material between the exterior wall and interior paneling. As Ranger Calloway noted in his report, the room appears designed for activities requiring both restraint and discretion. As the investigation continued through April 1885, the response from the Bitter Creek community revealed a complex relationship with Martha's establishment. Many expressed shock and revulsion, but others displayed a curious reluctance to condemn the women outright. Several regular patrons admitted to Sheriff Hargrove that they had noticed oddities, strange sounds at night, occasional items of clothing or possessions that seemed to change hands inexplicably, the peculiar taste of the famous stew, but had chosen not to question too deeply. A local rancher, William Teague, expressed a sentiment echoed by several townspeople. "You understand, out here, folks mind their business if they want others to mind theirs." Martha ran a clean place, served good food at fair prices. If some drifters or outlaws disappeared after staying there, well, most figured they'd moved on or met trouble elsewhere. Nobody wanted to look too hard at what put meat on their plates, long as it filled their bellies. Ezekiel Johnson, the town barber, perhaps summarized the community's willful blindness most succinctly in his testimony. Folks liked having a place where the food was good and questions weren't asked. Out here, sometimes it's better not to know a person's business too well. Martha kept to herself, but kept our bellies full. Maybe we should have wondered how she managed when the drought killed so many cattle and game was scarce. But nobody goes hungry and then asks why there's food on their plate. The case became more complex when investigators discovered financial records indicating that Martha made regular payments to someone identified only as the judge. These payments, delivered quarterly according to the ledger, suggested possible protection from local law enforcement or judiciary. The amounts, substantial by frontier standards, raised questions about corruption within the legal system that was supposed to protect travelers and residents alike. Sheriff Hargrove, under increasing scrutiny from Ranger Calloway, eventually admitted that Judge Samuel Blackwood, who presided over the county court, dined regularly at Martha's establishment free of charge. The sheriff's reluctance to investigate previous disappearances also came under examination. Hargrove defended his inaction. Travelers come and go all the time. We can't launch a manhunt every time someone changes their plans or takes a different trail. Besides, most who disappeared were drifters or men running from something, not the sort folks spend resources looking for. Judge Blackwood, when questioned by Ranger Calloway, denied any knowledge of Martha's activities, but could not explain why he had dismissed previous concerns raised about missing persons in the area. Records indicated that when Henry Miller had attempted to file a formal missing persons report for Thomas Wentworth, Judge Blackwood had refused to authorize an investigation, citing insufficient evidence of foul play and the transient nature of the purported victim. The Fort Worth Gazette reported on April 18, 1885, questions arise regarding the extent of official knowledge or complicity in the Bitter Creek atrocities. Judge Blackwood has taken leave of absence pending further inquiry. Sources close to the investigation suggest financial transactions between the accused and certain officials may have facilitated the prolonged nature of these crimes. Ranger Calloway has requested assistance from Austin to ensure the investigation proceeds without local interference. Evidence of broader community involvement emerged as the investigation continued. A letter found among Martha's possessions from the deacon of the local church thanked her for generous contributions to the building fund and her reliable supply of meat for church suppers during the difficult winter months. The realization that many townsfolk had unwittingly consumed human flesh during community gatherings added another layer of horror to the case. As one resident told the Fort Worth Gazette, "To think we praised her Christian charity while eating, I haven't been able to keep food down since I heard." By early May, Martha and Ruth had been transferred to the more secure jail in Fort Worth to await trial. The women were kept in separate cells, and their behavior during confinement added yet another layer to the disturbing case. According to jail records, Martha remained remarkably composed, requesting cooking privileges in the prison kitchen, which were firmly denied, and often offering cooking advice to the prison staff. She maintained her innocence, claiming the evidence had been planted by business rivals or men who resented a woman's success. Ruth, by contrast, alternated between periods of catatonic silence and frenzied writing, covering the walls of her cell with recipes and ingredient lists using a piece of charcoal she had somehow acquired. When questioned by prison officials about her writings, she would only say, "The methods must be preserved." Future generations will understand the efficiency. Her apparent detachment from the moral implications of her actions disturbed even experienced prison guards. The prison physician, Dr. William Harper, noted in his examination report that both women showed signs of moral insensibility rather than insanity. He wrote, "They comprehend fully the nature of their actions, but appear to lack the normal human response of remorse or recognition of wrongdoing." Mrs. Thornhill, in particular, speaks of her crimes with the same tone one might use to discuss weather or crop yields. Miss Collins exhibits a more complex condition, combining unusual fixation on culinary methodology with an apparent inability to recognize human beings as anything more than potential ingredients. Neither woman appears to meet the legal standard for insanity, as they understand the nature and wrongfulness of their actions. Yet both display profound abnormalities of moral sentiment. As preparations for the trial proceeded, the case attracted attention throughout Texas and beyond. Newspaper accounts, often lurid and sensationalized, spread the story of the cannibal cooks of Bitter Creek, as far as New Orleans and St. Louis. Reporters descended on the small town, interviewing anyone with connections to the boarding house or its proprietors. The publicity complicated jury selection, as finding impartial jurors untainted by newspaper accounts proved increasingly difficult. The case became something of a macabre attraction, with souvenir hunters attempting to take pieces of the boarding house until authorities were forced to post guards. Photographers set up equipment to capture images of the now infamous building, selling prints to a public both repulsed and fascinated by the crimes. One enterprising individual even began selling bottles labeled as Martha's Secret Sauce until local authorities intervened. A potentially decisive turn in the case came in late May when Ruth Collins, apparently seeking leniency, offered to provide authorities with a complete confession. Over 3 days, Ruth dictated a statement to Ranger Calloway that filled nearly 50 pages, the document, portions of which were sealed by judicial order until 1950, detailed not only the mechanics of their operation, but also its origins. According to Ruth's confession, the practice began not as a planned enterprise, but as a desperate measure during the harsh winter of 1881-1882. A cattle rustler who sought refuge at the boarding house died of pneumonia, and with the ground frozen too hard for burial, Martha stored the body in the cellar. As supplies dwindled and paying customers grew scarce, Martha made what Ruth described as a practical decision. Ruth recounted Martha's reasoning. She said it was no different than what happens in a siege or a harsh winter in the mountains. She'd heard tell of the Donner Party and others who'd done what was necessary to survive. The man was already dead, no additional harm done, and there were hungry mouths to feed. This initial act, presented as a survival measure, crossed a boundary that made subsequent killings easier to justify and implement. The experience, rather than causing revulsion, awakened something in both women. Ruth wrote, "Mrs. Thornhill said we had discovered a solution to 2 problems at once. We would never lack for meat, and troublesome men could finally be of some use to decent women." She laughed when she said it, but I could see she wasn't entirely joking. The next time wasn't about survival. It was about a drunken miner who'd made advances and wouldn't take no for an answer. Martha said she'd show him what happened to men who didn't respect a lady's establishment. That was the first one we planned. Ruth's confession described Martha's background in ways that contradicted her public persona. Far from being the widow of a Confederate officer, Martha had allegedly worked in a New Orleans brothel before fleeing west after killing an abusive client. She had learned butchery skills from her father, who had operated a slaughterhouse in Georgia before the war. These experiences had apparently combined to create both her culinary knowledge and her disregard for human life, particularly male life. Perhaps most disturbing were Ruth's descriptions of how they refined their techniques over time. She detailed their methods for selecting victims, the precise composition of the drugged whiskey, and the most efficient ways to process a body. She even included observations about which cuts of meat were most suitable for different recipes, noting that the thigh provides the finest texture for stew, while the tenderloin requires only minimal seasoning. Ruth explained their business model with disturbing clarity. "We calculated that each suitable subject could generate between 15 and 20 servings of stew, depending on their size and condition. With each bowl selling for 35 cents, a single traveler might yield as much as $7 in revenue, far more than the $1 or $2 they might spend at the establishment before their contribution. And that's not counting the value of their possessions, which usually more than covered any expenses associated with their processing." Ruth's confession also implicated several others in peripheral roles. Stagecoach drivers who deliberately directed certain travelers to Martha's establishment for a fee, a grave digger who supplied lye without asking questions, and at least 2 local officials besides Judge Blackwood who had actively helped conceal evidence of disappearances. The reach of Martha's influence proved more extensive than initially suspected. One of the most disturbing aspects of Ruth's confession concerned her own background. She claimed to have been the illegitimate daughter of a plantation owner and a kitchen slave, raised in the household but treated as a servant. Her mother had taught her cooking skills from an early age, creating in her a passion for culinary arts, but few opportunities to pursue them legitimately. After her mother's death and facing abuse from the plantation owner's legitimate family, she had fled west, eventually encountering Martha, who recognized her talents and offered her a position that evolved into their macabre partnership. "I never had qualms about what we did," Ruth stated in her confession. "In my experience, men had always consumed women in one way or another. We simply reversed the equation, and I could finally practice my art without limitations, experimenting with techniques no cookbook would ever contain. Mrs. Thornhill provided the opportunity, but I perfected the methods. The praise we received for our cooking was the only recognition of my skills I'd ever known." Martha, when confronted with Ruth's confession, neither confirmed nor denied its contents. Her only recorded response was, "That girl always did have an imagination and a loose tongue." That's a dangerous combination. Whether this was an attempt to discredit Ruth's account or simply an observation remains unclear from the historical record. The trial, scheduled to begin on June 15, 1885, never took place. On the morning of June 10th, guards discovered Martha Thornhill dead in her cell. The official cause of death was recorded as apoplexy, though rumors persisted of possible suicide or even poisoning. An examination revealed traces of an unidentified substance in her last meal, but technology of the time could not determine its exact nature. Some speculated that Martha's death conveniently silenced someone who could have implicated powerful figures in the region. The Fort Worth Gazette reported, "Mrs. Thornhill was found seated at her small writing desk, pen still in hand, apparently in the midst of composing a document. The nature of this final writing is not being disclosed by authorities, though sources suggest it may have contained names of associates or customers with special knowledge of her activities. Whether her death resulted from natural causes or more sinister circumstances may never be determined." Ruth Collins, now the sole defendant, was declared unfit to stand trial after a psychological examination found her detached from reality and fixated on culinary matters to the exclusion of understanding her circumstances. She was committed to the State Lunatic Asylum in Austin, where records indicate she remained until her death from tuberculosis in 1891. Asylum notes describe her as a model patient who volunteered regularly in the kitchen but was kept strictly to vegetable preparation. Dr. Thomas Hadley, who treated Ruth during her commitment, left a more detailed account in his private papers, discovered in 1957. Miss Collins remains one of the most disturbing cases I have encountered in 30 years of practice. She displays perfect lucidity when discussing cooking techniques or recipes, maintaining an encyclopedic knowledge of seasonings and preparation methods. Yet she cannot or will not acknowledge the inappropriateness of her former culinary practices. When I attempted to discuss the moral implications of cannibalism, she replied with a discourse on the relative tenderness of different muscle groups and the importance of proper aging techniques. It is as if her mind has compartmentalized her actions entirely, separating the technical aspects of her crimes from their human cost. Most disturbing is her continued insistence that her methods represented a superior form of culinary art that was simply ahead of its time. Ruth's final years were marked by a gradual physical decline, but no apparent moral awakening. Asylum records indicate she maintained a journal of recipes until her death, though careful monitoring ensured these contained only conventional ingredients. A nurse who attended her in her final days reported that Ruth's last coherent words were a request that her special recipes be preserved, as she was certain future generations will recognize their value. The boarding house itself became the subject of much debate within the Bitter Creek community. Some advocated burning the structure to the ground as a way of erasing the horror it represented. Others, concerned about property values and the town's reputation, argued for simply repurposing the building. In the end, a compromise was reached. The structure was partially demolished, with the kitchen and cellar filled in with lime and concrete before being sealed completely. The main building was stripped to its frame and reconstructed with new materials, eventually becoming a general store under new ownership. Despite these efforts to move forward, the legacy of Martha's boarding house proved difficult to escape. Business at the general store struggled as customers reported unpleasant sensations and inexplicable unease while shopping. Multiple owners attempted to make the location viable, but by 1890, the building stood empty, gradually falling into disrepair. Local children dared each other to approach the abandoned structure at night, claiming to hear sounds of chopping from the sealed cellar or smell cooking odors when the wind blew from certain directions. The town of Bitter Creek itself never fully recovered from the notoriety of the case. The population declined steadily in the years following the revelations, with many families choosing to relocate rather than remain associated with the cannibal town. By 1900, what had once been a promising frontier settlement had dwindled to little more than a cluster of buildings around the railroad depot, primarily serving as a way station rather than a destination. The story might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for Elmer Whitfield, a junior reporter for the Fort Worth Gazette, who had covered the initial investigation. Fascinated by the case, Whitfield spent years tracking down former patrons of Martha's establishment, collecting their testimonies and impressions. In 1901, he published a small volume titled The Bitter Creek Boarding House, a study in frontier justice and human depravity, which preserved the case details for future generations. Whitfield's book included several details that had been withheld from newspaper accounts, including the estimated number of victims, which he placed at 23 based on possessions recovered, and excerpts from Ruth's journal that had not been released publicly. He also raised questions about the extent of local complicity, suggesting that the sudden deaths of two potential witnesses during the investigation period were unlikely to be coincidental. The book received little attention outside Texas at the time of its publication, but gained new interest in the 1950s when researcher Margaret Campbell discovered Whitfield's work while studying frontier crime. Campbell's subsequent articles in historical journals brought academic attention to the case, particularly regarding what it revealed about isolation, community dynamics, and the unique vulnerabilities of travelers in the post-Civil War Texas frontier. Campbell also located previously sealed court documents and conducted interviews with elderly residents of the region who still remembered the case. Her research revealed that the effects of Martha and Ruth's crimes extended well beyond their immediate victims. Families who had lost loved ones without explanation finally received answers, though the confirmation that their relatives had met such ends provided little comfort. One such family was that of Thomas Wentworth, the cattle buyer, whose distinctive watch chain had first raised suspicions. His daughter, Elizabeth, wrote to Campbell in 1952, "My mother waited years for news, always believing he would return. When we finally learned what happened in 1885, she said, 'It would have been kinder never to have known. Some mystery should remain unsolved.'" The site of the former boarding house remained undeveloped throughout the 20th century. Local lore held that the land was cursed, and despite the expansion of nearby Fort Worth, the property remained vacant. In 1963, during construction of a highway access road, workers excavating near the former boarding house location discovered additional human remains that had gone undetected during the original investigation. These were buried with proper ceremony in the Fort Worth Cemetery with a simple marker reading, "Unknown Travelers, Bitter Creek, 1885. The most enduring legacy of the case may be its impact on local culture. Throughout East Texas, the phrase "Martha's Special Recipe" became shorthand for something suspicious or unwholesome. Parents would warn children who asked what was for dinner that it might be Martha's stew if they didn't behave. The cautionary aspect of the story warning travelers to be wary of too generous offers and isolated establishments, persisted long after the details of the actual crimes had blurred in public memory. Historical assessments of the case have evolved over time. Early accounts tended to portray Martha and Ruth simply as monsters, aberrations in an otherwise orderly society. Later analyses, particularly those from the 1970s onward, placed their crimes in the context of frontier gender relations, economic pressures, and the limited options available to women without male protection in the post-Civil War period. As historian Robert Davidson noted in his 1968 analysis, without excusing their actions, we must acknowledge that Martha Thornhill and Ruth Collins operated in a world where women's survival often depended on their relationship to men. They inverted this dynamic in the most extreme way imaginable. The case has occasionally resurfaced in popular culture, most notably in a 1959 episode of the radio program Texas Tales and Legends that dramatized a heavily sanitized version of events. The actual details were considered too disturbing for broadcast, with the cannibalistic elements removed entirely and Martha portrayed as a more conventional killer motivated by robbery. Even this tamed version generated complaints from listeners who found the content unsuitable. In 1967, a collection of Ruth Collins recipes, those for conventional non-human dishes, was discovered among Elmer Whitfield's papers donated to the Texas Historical Society. The recipes revealed a sophisticated culinary knowledge unusual for the frontier, with complex spice combinations and European techniques that suggested formal training somewhere in Ruth's background. This discovery prompted new questions about her origins and how someone with apparent refinement came to participate in such horrific acts. The boarding house ledger, preserved in the Texas State Archives, continues to draw researchers interested in identifying all of Martha's victims. The entries, cryptic but methodical, provide clues about individuals who passed through Bitter Creek between 1881 and 1885. Cross-referencing these entries with missing persons reports and unclaimed property records has allowed historians to attach names to approximately 18 of the estimated 23 victims. What remains most disturbing about the case, according to criminologist David Morrison writing in 1965, is not merely the nature of the crimes, but the community's tacit acceptance that enabled them. For nearly 4 years, Morrison wrote, an entire town consumed what they later admitted tasted unusual, while travelers vanished without investigation. This collective willingness to ignore obvious questions reflects a frontier mentality where survival often meant minding one's own affairs, regardless of the cost to others. The final known victim before the discovery of remains was Robert Keller, a surveyor working for the railroad whose disappearance in February 1885 initially raised no alarms. His equipment was recovered from Martha's trophy collection, and his family later received his surveying tools and personal effects. His sister, Mary Keller Adams, wrote to Sheriff Hargrove in late 1885, I find no comfort in knowing Robert's fate, but I am grateful he is no longer among the countless disappeared whose families live in eternal uncertainty. Closure, even of the most horrible kind, is still closure. Today, the site where Martha Thornhill's boarding house once stood remains vacant, marked only by a small historical plaque installed in 1985 that makes no mention of cannibalism, but simply notes, near this location stood a boarding house associated with numerous disappearances in the early 1880s. The case led to significant reforms in Texas law enforcement procedures regarding missing persons investigations. For those who know the full story, the sanitized plaque seems insufficient acknowledgement of what occurred, but perhaps it's fitting that the true horror remains slightly obscured, preserved in archives and historical accounts, rather than prominently displayed. Like the boarding house cellar, some aspects of history are best not brought fully into the light, remembered as warnings rather than displayed as spectacle. The case of Martha Thornhill and Ruth Collins stands as a dark chapter in Texas history, a reminder of the isolation and lawlessness that could allow such horrors to continue undetected for years. It speaks to the vulnerability of travelers in an era before instant communication, to the desperation that might drive women to monstrous extremes, and to the human capacity for willful blindness when confronting uncomfortable truths. As for the famous stew recipe that brought so many travelers to their doom, it died with Martha Thornhill in that Fort Worth jail cell. Perhaps that, at least, is something for which we can be grateful.